welcome to another episode. I'm joined by Nam again. We're trying to debrief what happened in Denver, just like we did for DEF CON, which seems to be like a popular episode with the viewers. So we're trying to recreate that magic this time. Welcome, Nam.
Thank you for having me, Arjun.
Okay, so all of us just made our way back home, still suffering through jet lag, fucked up sleep schedules. How are you holding up?
I should be better than you because I had to only make a difference of 2 hours versus 12 hours for you. And it is funny that I guess 3 months later we all gathered again, just literally on the other side of the world to talk about very, very similar topics. But I think I'm doing okay. Just general sleep deprivation, but that's unfortunately not due to jet lag.
Yeah, I mean, so it's just been 3 months since all of us pretty much met in Bangkok. So not a lot had changed, but still there were a lot of new topics that came up, and we're going to try to come up with key takeaways from our conference related to the Interop bubble. But in general, before we dive deeper into Interop, I want to get your takes on the overall conference, right? How did you feel about the turnout, main events, side events? There was a lot of hot takes on Twitter going on.
Yes, Twitter loves to give those hot takes because you need to engagement farm, I guess, somehow in this market. But my takeaways, I guess so. And ETHDenver was actually my first ever conference. I didn't really go to conferences up until 22. And I remember the ETHDenver was always quite poppin', 22, 23 was very poppin'. Actually, I remember 23 being super overrun with NFT people and Lambos. And so definitely this year wasn't that at all. And I think that's probably what people comment on a lot, is that just kind of felt less active. I think there was one thing I heard was Hong Kong was Consensus Hong Kong was the week before, and I think a lot of people were probably forced to decide hey, do I go to Hong Kong or do I go to Denver? And honestly, if I wasn't so close to Denver, I might have picked Hong Kong too. I think I actually have a lot of friends in the Denver Boulder area, and it definitely seemed this year, even outside ETHDenver, it seemed kind of dead. And so I'm not exactly sure what that reason is. But definitely felt I think quieter. I suspect a lot of the Asian folks just didn't make it out to Denver.
I mean, to be honest, it was my first time in Denver, and I always heard very good things about the conference in general. Maybe not the city, but I liked the city because this was my first time there, and I had no sort of comparison framework. I was not comparing Denver to New York, right? So I still liked Denver.
I was going to say, I think you like this is the first time in the US. I think that is, don't let that color your experience at Denver. There's many, many great cities in the US.
Yes, so relatively it might not be the best city, but it was still a good city, right? But in general, in my mind, the conference in Denver was supposed to be so much more bigger, but it was not the case, right? The main event had different vibes because Ethereum was not the main focus point of the main event, which was sort of weird. And side events, as always, there were a lot of side events, but I feel in general, there was a good turnout of people. People might shit on Denver, but they still made their way. The good crowd still made their way.
Yes. I also wonder, it depended on when you went to the main event. Because, honestly, I went on Thursday, and it was, perfectly fine. It was kind of what I experienced previously. Honestly, a lot of booths. I feel for a conference, this is still the most booked out main event. I feel in most other conferences, nobody goes to the main event. Few people did actually go to the main event. So I don't know what, maybe I have.
But did you see the lineup problem? All the talks and everything were not about Ethereum or kind of anti-Ethereum, and then the sponsors and everything were also Ethereum competitors.
Yes. I think maybe that's. I think that's always kind of been the case, to be honest. I think what is probably different is that people are I think bashing Ethereum is super in these days. That wasn't the case a year ago. And so I think probably people felt maybe conferences like ETHDenver are our safe space, and I think that's unfortunately not the case. But I definitely do think that other I think ecosystems have always played a large role in ETHDenver as well.
To be honest, it'll be nicer if it was just focused on Ethereum, especially because of all the narrative and all of the problems on Twitter. It'll be nice if everyone just came together and talked about Ethereum. But that's not how the real world works. Money talks, you can sponsor things and change narrative, right?
Yes, absolutely.
But do you actually think the OGs are jaded right now? Did you get that feeling that OGs are finding it hard to get the motivation?
Yeah, maybe for people to, I think maybe not realize, but like Vitalik had this tweet, right, like where they announced this like advisory council to, I think the EF alongside other changes on the EF. And I think as part of it, there was like this large, like, in this council, I think a lot of them, maybe I would say, weren't quite as well known, maybe as you would expect. And then Vitalik came out with this, like, again, he's also on the like hot, spicy take part. But yeah, he was basically like, oh, OGs are too jaded. We need young people. And I do think that was quite the tweet. I don't know, like I've seen anything rile up people so much these days. And honestly, especially as, some of the OGs that have been working in the space, like I was, I think Arjun from Eric had like a really good take where I was like, hey, yeah, we've been fucking working on this roadmap that you've told us to work on for all these years. And so I think, yeah, telling them that they're jaded was kind of like a bit of a slap in the face, to be honest. So I don't actually personally think people are jaded. Like, I think, building is hard. Like, there's a lot of fucked up incentives. But I personally don't think they're jaded. I do think it's super easy to be jaded, and people love being jaded. Like, again, it's just like, it's like the teenage angst of like, I love being nihilistic because it's in. But I generally don't say people are much more jaded than before.
I mean, in general, like you can never be always excited, right? Like there's always going to be like high times and like down times. In general, I feel in terms of the cycle as well, we're in a weird phase where we had a good run in terms of price action. Now everything is down like 50 to 90%. So it's natural that everybody feels like, okay, maybe we need a break and come back like 6 months later when things look bottomed out, which they did after the ETHDenver like event, like over the weekend when the Trump tweet came out and markets started pumping 50, 30, 40%. But then that pump is also gone. So it's like we're all in that weird phase in terms of building, in terms of the cycle, where everything does not seem right, but it's just one of those phases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would love to. I mean, I'm sure somebody has done it. I just haven't seen it in a while. But like, like the sentiment to price correlation must be super freaking high.
I'm sure Kaito has a dashboard for it. Okay. Let's talk about Interop, right? So Interop was finally one of the main focuses of the conference. Like literally everyone was talking about it. And Arbitrum had an event. Optimism and Arbitrum also came together to have like this Interop offsite. And you were leading one of the breakout sessions, right? So why don't you set up what was that event about? And then we can like kind of go into details about like some of the takeaways from that particular day.
Yes. Yeah, I think, last time we chatted about this, right? We mentioned that there was this like Interop offsite, Interop forum in Bangkok, I think on the last day in Bangkok, right? And that was, I think, the first time where we had this kind of like well-organized place where all of us could come together and talk about Interop. Like obviously preceding that, we talked a lot about Interop, but there was like an actual like event where all we talked about is Interop and how can we solve it. Right, that was when like Vitalik went into war mode. We had all of these L2s on stage, which Vitalik like bullied into like making commitments on stage. But I think that was like really cool, and I think that was, to me at least, I found that to be the kind of like start of I think a lot of conversations about like, hey, how do we as an Ethereum ecosystem come together and actually like solve some of these problems, not just right like by ourselves or within our ecosystems, but more broadly speaking. This was also personally when I started talking with Josh from the Ethereum Foundation, right, who organized that forum and who's kind of like been leading the charge on like honestly just trying to figure it out. Like I definitely felt like the mandate was kind of like, hey Josh, Interop is not your problem. And so I think like, since Bangkok, to solve Interop, which, sounds like he solved it. But, I think from Bangkok, I think there's been a lot of, I would say, conversations about like, hey, what can we do, right? People should have seen probably the like calls that he's organized about like getting people together. And I think Denver was kind of like a nice checking point to kind of see like, hey, okay, what have we been able to do in 3 months, right? Which again, like we said, like building takes forever. Some people have been building for years. And so I think in some ways what like happened was like a lot of people were like, oh, like everybody's talking about Interop, so now something sort of happened within 3 months. And other people are like, well, look, like this shit is hard, right? Like getting everybody on the same page is hard. And I think that probably reflected itself in some of the calls, but also ultimately on the Interop offsite event, which was like, at least for me, the first day of the conference. And so I'd say the 3 breakout sessions that, I think it was 3, the 3 breakout sessions that the kind of group organized, which I believe was EF, Arbitrum and Optimism, were basically, right, like the user journeys, basically kind of like trying to figure out like, hey, like what are users in the Ethereum ecosystem kind of like going through, like what being able to be a bit more like organized about it, right? Like Intents, which I think has obviously received a lot of attention. We can talk about that. And then I think actually the original one I think we all talked about was basically standardization of messaging. And so those are like, 3 workout groups. We had like the whole day in a, hotel conference room. And it was definitely, I think in Bangkok, we had also breakout rooms, but they were like both like, I think like either half an hour each with a lot of people like, it was kind of hard to like actually make progress. And but I'm kind of honestly curious, like I think you attended obviously some of them as well.
Yeah.
Kind of like curious what your, because I don't think you were in the previous one, right? So I'm kind of curious what your like kind of experience was like.
No, it was actually like pretty fascinating to see everyone in one room, because in general we see all of these faces in calls, and it's honestly not the same, right? Like when I walked in, I was like, okay, literally everyone is there, and you can have proper discussions because you can actually talk to people. Like someone says something, you can actually see their face, you can see that they're coming from like a genuine thought process, like they have a correct take, but you have different thoughts, so you can have a discussion. So this was the first time where literally the Optimism team was there, Arbitrum was there, all the Interop teams were there, someone from the EF was also there. So for me it was very nice to actually have a conversation and see where everyone is at in terms of their understanding of the Interop ecosystem and like what's needed to potentially solve it or like eventually solve it, right? And like maybe we can go into like our own breakout session, which was the intense one, but I feel like everyone kind of came out with the same takeaways, where a lot of the tools to solve interop are there, but we just need the right people to actually either be opinionated or build like standards around things that can be like agnostic to one solution.
Yeah, maybe one more point, I think, on the like everybody being in person, right? Like I think the event kind of was started off with a call that included, right, like also like all other people who are remote who couldn't make it to Denver. And I think being in person on the call with everybody else in the room was I think kind of like a weird experience, because there's definitely this kind of like, oh, I guess if you're in person you can see the other person and you can like, right, like you will like, I guess a typical internet thing, like you can't like, you got to be like nicer to them basically. And I think obviously there were like some more heated discussions. But yeah, like I think everything just seemed much easier, like in person.
I feel like it's the opposite. Like people seem ruder over the internet, but when you're in person, you see that they're nicer and they're like actual humans, and they're trying to help you out. But you have more context on their body language, how they're trying to speak.
Yes.
Okay. So in terms of the intense breakout room, like, did you feel like we made progress?
I personally think so. I think again, this probably reflects what the earlier point of like, oh, optimism and pessimism, and maybe I think some people just, maybe I'm just like more naturally like, oh, optimistic that we can like standardize this time around, right? Like there was definitely this point of kind of like, oh, let's please not try to like repeat the same mistakes, right? Like I think like XERC20 was mentioned a lot of times of like, how do we avoid the fate of XERC20, right? Where like honestly the standard perfectly great, right? Like we are using it a lot. Like I think it like makes a lot of sense. But people have this feeling that like XERC20 didn't quite accomplish what it could accomplish, and so there was definitely a kind of conversation about, hey, like what should we do here? And I think maybe everything just comes down to what your expectations were, right? And I think my expectations definitely weren't like, oh, we're just going to be all together in kumbaya, right? Like it's going to be like difficult. Of people have different incentives. They have like a lot of money. They'll spend a lot of time on their projects, and obviously they have an interest in making sure they and we. I'm not excluding myself there, but have an interest in kind of like seeing things develop in a particular way. And I think like one thing that was interesting to me is that like after we've had this big push on the open intense framework, which people I think have seen the week before, right? Like everybody I think was very much like, oh, like what is this thing? Like right, like why are we all pushing this? Is this just a marketing campaign? And so like I think there was definitely like in the beginning of the session there was a lot of kind of like, hey guys. Right, like yes, it is early. Right, there's a lot of like things that we can do here, like and not overly focus on like what it is today. And I do think, like definitely in the first half, I was kind of like, ugh, like that this is not going to go anywhere. And I do think towards the end, I'm very glad that we were able to kind of like talk about concrete action items of like, hey, what can we do together? What can we collaborate on that actually does help many different projects and ultimately make Interop and Intense more accessible to everybody?
I think like all of us kind of came together to decide that one, education is very important. Like we know there are solutions to things, but who are the people who are actually using these tools at the end of the day? So like we decided to let's say write a playbook for the new chains for like how to think about interop, or actually build open source tools that literally every chain trying to figure out interop or intents would need. So I feel like the general consensus around that was pretty nice. That okay, all of us need to sort of invest in educating and building open source tooling around it, which I know is like music to your ears because you love open source interop and tooling.
Yes, yeah, I think I agree. Totally, was awesome. Like that was like I originally expected for us to mostly talk about like technical things. So maybe that's me as an engineer, like we need to do this abstraction, we need to do it right like this code. But I think the first and I think the primary objective that we've kind of talked about for the most part was like, hey, right, like if you are a new chain, unless you are like crazy like us and spent like 3-4 years only talking about interop, like there's no way for people to really understand, hey, like how should I think about interop? And this is not even like right, like saying like obviously we all have bias of like, we should use our thing or my thing, but even just having I think a like neutral like right, like GitHub repo or something where people can kind of like quickly learn about like, hey, these are the options in the market, these are the like right like projects I can pick, or hopefully open source interop as well. I think that was like a very nice first kind of like action item that we took as a group.
Also, like, what do you think about this market dynamic where literally every rollup is kind of building their own cluster of chains, right? Like, literally the Cosmos model, but I don't know, it has come about in an opposite direction where nobody started this way, but now we've all converged into this direction, right? And during the event, Caldera announced their meta layer, which like the team was also present at the intense breakout room. So it's nice that like things are moving in the right direction, but literally everyone is building like their own meta layer or a cluster of chains sort of design.
Yeah, it's I think it's coming all full circle. Like I remember like when we first started working on Hyperlane, right? Like part of the inspiration was when we talked with Zaki was kind of like, one thing I think that actually struck me this morning, I remember as we were trying to talk about the agenda here, is like, what is kind of our feeling about like standardization? And like one of the reasons was, we're like, right, like some people who've been working in this space for a while say like, all the building blocks are already there. Why are you reinventing the wheel with like these standards? And honestly, even we have done that, right? And like one of the things that we have done, right, is like, hey, we look at IBC and be like, hey, like, should we just use IBC or should we take inspiration from IBC? And I think part of what you just mentioned, right, is that, we all seem to basically build our own version of Cosmos. And in fact, I think it's true. And, actually, I don't want to claim too much intentionality in that like decision to not use Cosmos, but to build your own version of Cosmos. But I think for example, especially like Rollup as a service providers like Caldera, right, have noticed is that like, hey, like Rollup as a service like becomes at some point commoditized, and you have to think about like, hey, what is like a unique point about what you can bring to like your customers, right? That you're competing with other Rollup as a service providers. And I think it's very, very clear that like we just discussed with the playbook point, like if you are a new chain, like reasoning about interop becomes very difficult. And I think Rollup as a service providers are incredibly well positioned to basically like help these chains with interop. And that help primarily has looked like, let me put you in touch with the BD teams of these interop projects. But I'm really, really like excited to obviously like, see kind of like Caldera taking the first kind of like step towards actually building interop into their rollups and basically creating this kind of like ecosystem cluster of right like the meta layer. I think by the time this announcement go out, Gelato, who's also having their own rollup as service provider, is also going to announce that they have kind of like built Hyperlane into their abundance kind of like default cluster. And again, that doesn't mean that like people like have to use Hyperlane, right? It's just like that it comes out by default. And it's like, I think this is kind of like the vision that I think we've had from day one, and we kind of talked about building like an open source framework, is that like, look, this is going to be inevitable, right? Like whether that's actually just Rollup as a service providers, or even like, right, like Superchain, Arbitrum, right? Like there's going to be a lot of these kind of like clusters. We call them trade alliances. And that's just going to be like a natural evolution where like chains decide to band together to like have some notion of better interop that allows for a better user experience. But in exchange, right, they will take on some shared trust assumptions.
I guess permissionless expansion was one of the main takeaways. Like literally everyone was talking about it in one way or another. Like how do you either expand intents or like liquidity bridges to new chains, or how do you expand the interop protocols or like GMPs to new chains? So I feel like that's one key takeaway that I feel like we can definitely put down on paper, that literally everyone was talking about permissionless expansion because there are going to be so many chains and it's very hard for every chain to figure out which teams to talk to or who's the right person to talk to at XYZ team. So we need tooling that they can just take and build their own intents or interop solutions. With intents, the takeaway was that liquidity is still a problem. So how do you figure out liquidity? Nobody has an answer yet, other than I don't know, throw money into a pool and hope a solver kind of picks up that order flow. But I feel like yes, liquidity is still a problem, and I don't know if there's a clean solution for that yet, other than throwing money into
if I had to be like, again, I wanna be the optimistic guy, but if I had to be pessimistic about one thing, then it's that as well, right? I think it's that people I think honestly, you wrote a post like a year ago probably, right, about like it's solvers all the way down, right? Like that's like the untold secret of intents. Like I think people probably still don't quite understand just like how like bifurcated I think the market is, right? Like obviously like nowadays we see a lot of like very professional solvers. Like I think across this intent market is like getting much more competitive. But I think it's dominated by like very, very professional like solvers who like primarily care about the like 80 or 90% of flows which are happening between like, I don't know, Base, Arbitrum, Ethereum, Solana, right? And that's where it's super competitive, right? Like the fees basically like 1 or 2 bips, and like I think that works great for those chains. But then if you go to like a new long tail chain, like you just won't be able to like nobody, like there's chirps, there's no solver that's going to do this for you. I think, and it's funny, like I actually remember on the last debrief that we did for Bangkok, right? Like that's when I think we announced like our work on the Intents framework, and I think I mentioned this on the podcast. And the whole reason why we started working on this was, hey, how can we make intents more accessible, right? Like how can we even maybe make the team who's like deploying the chain, how can we make them run a solver? And like right now it would just be like too much, right? Like I generally say like, oh, it takes a team of like probably 2 engineers, like 6 months to like get that experience. And honestly, even like 3 months in after building, like I guess 4 months in after building this framework, it's like still feels like, oh, there's still a lot of building blocks that are necessary to make solving more accessible, to get it on permissionless long tail chains. Which ultimately, again, is like an interest that we have as a Hyperlane to make that experience accessible. And I know, right, like you as Li-Fi, like the same kind of like from arises, right? Like you talk a lot of these long tail chains, and like somebody's going to run a solver. And like, again, like I think you could probably talk about your experiences there, but it's clear to me, and that's why I'm so glad that like you've been able to work with Josh from the EF or like Hart from across about like, hey, how can we actually all work together? Because honestly, like, we can only do so much on the Intents framework ourselves.
I think that's where the standards and open source tooling will help a lot. But in general, I've been talking to a lot of like solvers throughout the last week. And my takeaway was that like the professional solvers, they are actually very rational actors and they only care about making money. So as soon as like the routes don't make sense for them, they will just switch it off, right? Like they don't care about it.
Yes.
And the other side of it, which comes with like permissionless expansion, that the responsibility for that is literally on the teams, like the Interop teams to run solvers. So on one side, we have professional solvers who care about making money and they're literally market makers. And on the other side, we have the protocol run solvers, who have to provide reliability because it's their protocol, right? So it's in their best interest to actually have a route, even if it means not making money or losing money on some of these routes. But I feel like the middle, where like we're trying to make a lot of the tooling accessible. I don't know how that part of the stack actually makes money, but that's another open question.
Yeah, it's a good question. Like my general mental model for this is kind of like Uniswap, right? Or like how Uniswap came about, where like, I think it is also very bifurcated, right? It's either like you are like a big ass project and right, like you basically had to work with market makers on centralized exchanges, right? Like who make basically your token. But obviously if any project that isn't like that, like you just like, right, like it's like there's no shot at like a market maker finding this enough important, or you have to pay them like a lot of money to like kind of like make that. And I think Uniswap came about and was basically like, hey guys, why don't you just make your own token, right? Like just put liquidity in this like Uniswap pool, and like, is it going to be super efficient? Maybe not, right? Like, are you going to be profitable providing liquidity in that pool? Probably not. But like you have something, right? Like you have an experience that like users can actually like arguably is even more reliable than like on a centralized exchange, right? Because it's decentralized smart contracts. It's just totally available all the time. And I think like we really need to get to this point with intents. I think we need to get to this point where like a team, all they can do is they can just like put their own money in a thing. This thing runs. And users actually get that kind of product experience. Because what's definitely shitty, right? Like I think we have also talked with a bunch of solvers, right? And they're like, oh, you have to like guarantee us this amount of fee revenue so that like we are like going to be on this chain for like 2 months. And after 2 months, if we don't find worth it, we like exit out. And that's just not going to work. That's not going to be an Interop experience that like is going to allow this rollup centric roadmap to succeed. And so like I definitely don't know how quickly we'll get to the point where like let's say an open source reference solver in the Open Intents framework is going to be like super fucking profitable even on a long tail chain. But I think just like having something that allows people to get right like from 0 to 1 on a long tail chain, I think is a tractable goal and something that I'm very excited to work with different people on.
I mean, we are already seeing like these types of projects getting more funding and also like launching in the market. So I feel like over the next year or 2 years, we might have the Uniswap movement of intents. But like in general, I feel there are all of these building blocks in place where it feels like the first phase of intents and interop is done, and we're going into like the second phase where people are moving in the right direction, but the market still needs to decide like some of the winners. And as those winners become more obvious, order flow and liquidity will like kind of just aggregate towards them. I don't know. In my head, it just feels like that there are too many solutions right now, and eventually over time, over the next year, 2 years or so, some of these things will like clear out, and we will have some sort of like unified Ethereum or unified crypto ecosystem.
Interesting. All right, let's debrief what like I don't know DevConnects at the end of the year or something, and see how that played out. I would probably take the other side of that argument and say like I think the reason why there's actually so many different approaches in Interop is because it's not clear to me what is the winning solution. And I guess maybe you could say like, oh, this is what DEXs were like, right? Like AMMs were like before Uniswap came about, right?
The designs, there's consensus on the designs, right? Like we have intents, we have a combination of intents and like Interop token standards. So I feel like the designs are clearer today, but there are just too many players trying to do it. So the market is segregated across all of these players.
Interesting. Like, are you saying, for example, like, oh, there's too many intent protocols? Like, there's like across, there's like DLN, there's like router, or like I guess what is the one like quote unquote category that you think like, oh yeah, basically they're like all the same thing, and like this has to clear out?
To be honest, like I'm not even talking about Interop protocols in particular. I'm talking about like all of these ecosystems, right? Like not every RAS provider will have hundreds of chains. Not every Optimism, Arbitrum will have like hundreds of chains being built out. So it'll be interesting to see which ecosystem actually gets like, let's say 10 chains with genuine order flow of that you can actually have like some sort of super chain sort of ecosystem.
Yeah, I'll definitely take the other side of that argument. I 100% believe that all of these ecosystems that we talk about will actually have hundreds of chains. I mean, maybe not within the next year. I think that's probably more difficult. But I do believe that like all these ecosystems that are popping up, that's called right, like Superchain, Arbitrum, like the Rollup as service providers. Like I think all of these ecosystems will exist. They will all have meaningful economic activity, and they will need kind of like their ecosystem specific take on Interop. And I would even make the statement that like you will see even more of them. Like I think if you think there's already too many ecosystems, like just we are getting started. Like
great, more fragmentation. That's why I wake up.
Well, I guess what do you think is the fragmentation right now though? Like what do you like? Is the fragmentation basically like, oh, it sucks to like move within this like superchain within superchain is great, but then moving out of the superchain to let's say like meta layer, like that becomes like too difficult?
I mean, I just think because Interop is not solved, quote unquote, there are too many ecosystems that are trying to have some sort of solution in place for Interop, right? Like Caldera announced their solution. We know Optimism is working on their stuff. Arbitrum is working on their stuff. Everything is early days right now, but they're sort of coming together to decide the same concepts. Like they have intents, they have like token standards, but none of them have seen adoption because nothing is there yet. So I feel like over the next 1 or 2 years, as chains kind of make the decision which ecosystem they prefer, we will see some of these Interop ecosystems being more mature than the other, and like activity also like UX will become better, activity will also sort of congregate
I see. Zones. Yeah, I guess I will say like I think that's a good point, right? Like, I think if I understand correctly, what your point is that as you create more of these ecosystems and everybody's kind of like doing it from scratch, like you just have this like build up phase of like actually getting to a reasonable Interop experience, and like ecosystems that either have the money or the head start will be able to kind of like I think run away with their ecosystem, which makes it harder for other ecosystems to establish. Like I didn't pay you to say that, but this is actually coincidentally exactly the reason why I think right, like something like Hyperlane is really like why it makes so much sense, right? Like I think if you're Caldera, right, like and we talked to the Caldera team about this because originally they probably did think about like, oh, right, like we need to have like a kind of like unique angle here, so let's build this from scratch. And like I totally agree with you. Like if you build things from scratch, like it's going to be very hard for you to now compete, right? Like I think OPs, right, like I think at least a year in their kind of like super chain endeavors, right? And like still, I think it's on DevNet now, but right, like, it's going to take a bit to get to production. And so if you believe, right, like the end game for your kind of like project is an ecosystem, like you cannot, right, like start a year late on like building an ecosystem. And this is where I think, yeah, again, like ecosystems have to make a play of like, hey, am I going to, right, like maybe partner with an Interop project, right, and like kind of get commercial agreements, or do I use like an open source framework that kind of gives me most of these kind of building blocks, right? And which I think we just said, like the building blocks are all basically the same, right? It's like some general message passing interface, settlement, right? Like security trust assumptions, right? Some intent level on top, right? Aggregation ultimately over. And so I think these are the building blocks that are going to be out there. And yeah, at this point, nobody should do that from scratch. And I think the question becomes, right? Like, how do you decide which of these building blocks to use, right? And like, what are the kind of like dependencies that you take on? And I think like, whenever I talk to you and the Li-Fi guys, I always get a sense of, yeah, like, hey, we cannot, right, like make our business dependent on somebody else's like profit motive, whether like serving us is good enough. And so I think like we're definitely very aligned that like, yeah, like not wanting to have that is going to be an important aspect of how people decide.
Let's see, we have like teams like Caldera doing their own like open thing, and then we also have teams like Initia, which have a more opinionated approach. So we have all the different types of approaches, and we'll see how it pans out. But
even Initia, right? Like,
okay.
Oh, sorry. No, just quick on Initia, right? Like even Initia, right? Like I think has decided like, oh, let's not, right, like build our Interop standard from scratch, right? Like let's use IBC and layer 0 kind of like to do that. And I do believe that like just going forward, like ecosystems really have to, even like I think people who have already started their own thing, like, and obviously don't want to name names here, but like I think they should consider basically like, hey, like building the whole stack by ourselves is going to be difficult. Like we should probably work with other kind of like projects to do this.
Work with us. That's all we think about. So like work with all the teams. So on the point of intents, like I feel in Bangkok, intents were being marketed as this like magic pill for UX, but this time there was a little bit more like realism in every conversation, where we were talking about the bottlenecks, the limitations of intents. Like scaling is hard, liquidity is a problem. So at least in all the nerd side events of Interop, it felt like there was people who were more practical about the future of intents, and like they're great, but they're not the go-to end-all solution for everything in Interop.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, what in your perspective do you think like I guess we talked about, right, like the liquidity constraints, but like, do you think is that the reason why people say that, oh yeah, intents are going to be limited? Like, and therefore, where are they going to be limited? Because honestly, like, again, right, like specifically on, let's say, based on Arbitrum, right, like intents seem perfectly fine, right? Or are we saying that even there, it's like kind of like some limitations?
No, so like on chains where liquidity is sorted out, intents work perfectly. But because Interop is such an ever-expanding problem, like every chain means Interop is not solved. Like every new chain means like you have to figure out Interop again. So I feel like with every new chain, there's a liquidity problem, there's a connectivity problem. Like, how do you connect that chain not only to an Ethereum base or Arbitrum, but to the entire ecosystem? That problem will always remain, right? Like, so there was more practicality around intents for new chains, and how do you expand this intents architecture to a new chain, to every chain. In general, all of the intent protocols in the market today have, I don't know, 15, 20 chains connected. So we're already seeing sort of limits of how far this can go without breaking the system.
Yeah. I'm curious. I don't know how much you can say here, but like, how do you think that is being solved? Like, sorry, not how is it being solved, because again, a lot of people trying to solve it, but like, what do you think is the winning like strategy? Because I also know that you've had, right, like a few panels of like, oh, intents versus like OTs or whatever. So I'm kind of curious, like, yeah, how do we solve that problem?
I mean, honestly, I think from day one, it has to be a combination. Like, it cannot be either or. I always felt that this debate was so stupid, intents versus OFTs, because like they're not competitive. You have to use both of them, right? So I didn't understand the point of this debate. Like, sure, maybe one can be faster and cheaper than the other in certain circumstances, but that doesn't mean that they're competitive. Even for intents to work, you need liquidity, right? So many intents protocols that we work with wait for a Stargate to connect to a new chain so that they can then rebalance, right? So for intents to rebalance, you need token standards, because token standards allow you to mint and burn any size. Like, token standards are the new native bridges, basically. So you need both, like a hybrid approach that works together. So that's what I feel like is the right solution. But of course, like not every protocol or not every team will have both solutions. So it's in their best interest to talk about one being better than the other.
Yes, I do think this actually brings us back to the ecosystems, right? Like if you're an ecosystem, this is basically becomes like a number one goal for you, right? Like sure, you could say, right, like as Arbitrum, like, oh, we want intents, but what you really need is what like right, like the superchain did, which is basically like, hey, work towards like easy rebalancing in size with shared trust assumptions. And so I think like I totally agree, those things go hand in hand, and like I think we will see the like inevitability, I guess, of that partnership over as time.
I mean, Superchain is already working on their token standards. They're also working on their like intents framework. So I feel like they have the playbook in a way. It still needs to be used, or it still needs to be shipped as well. But the parts are there for sure.
Absolutely.
The other thing was chain abstraction. So I feel like Bangkok chain abstraction was one of the main talking points. But this time, or maybe that was because like there was some side event, like a full day for chain abstraction. But this time there was no particular event. So I feel like there was more practicality around what chain abstraction unlocks. And people are starting to understand how like chain abstraction builds on top of Interop. And again, like it's not comparative. These things go hand in hand, and chain abstraction is like sort of this user-facing solution that builds on Interop Rails.
Yeah. I think this to be like, I think like you said, like in our projects sometimes have the tendency to just only think about the abstraction level and not think about like all the other pieces that like you need as well. And right, like I think as Hyperlane, we primarily focus on just messaging. And so I'll admit I'm definitely like a bit further away of like, higher levels, even on intents, right? Like our team doesn't really work on it, right? I've been fortunate to work with teams like Budo and Hashi on something like the open intents framework. But like right, like above, I think let's say basic intents, right? Like there's right like resource locks, there's like chain abstraction. And I think I agree that like I think there's probably some recognition that like, oh, we probably need the underlying layers to be more mature for us to really talk about this. But also I think at least with respect to like I think resource lock and chain abstraction, I think it becomes really interesting question of like who actually, right, like how are people going to consume these product experiences, right? Because I think at least with like something like message bridging or even intents, like I think it is a bit more obvious that like, oh yeah, like people are used to like going to like another bridge site to do the bridging basically. For something like chain abstraction, right? Like like is that going to be like this kind of feels like it has to be built into the wallet, right? Like because basically now like the resource lock kind of like acts a bit as like your smart contract wallet, and so you need certain features from resource locks that like obviously like let's say like a simple intent protocol or like a like token standard doesn't have to like do. And so like definitely talking with some of these chain abstraction protocols, kind of recognizing that there's a bit of more like maybe like user needs gathering or like kind of product strategy necessary to really figure out like where exactly they fit in this kind of like existing stakeholder base.
I mean, all the activity in crypto happens on wallets and interfaces, right? Like interfaces are sort of categorized into specific sections because you need to bootstrap order flow and attract users one way or another. So I feel like bridges today are kind of siloed into this particular category of moving funds from one chain to another. But if you look at even the bridge interfaces, they're adding swaps. So there's like cross-chain swaps. And as the mental model for people changes in crypto, where cross-chain swaps just become routine, I feel like bridge UIs will also sort of unlock like new levels of swapping functionality. And if you add more and more features like gas abstraction, like how do you handle chain switches, chain abstraction and like the user experience will become better and better. So I feel like, again, because teams have their own bad biases, we tend to see people talk about bridge UIs in a bad light, but they're also evolving. And like we're seeing it firsthand over the last 3 years, how like first bridge UI started with 6 assets, 6 chains. Today there are like 30 chains, thousands of assets, and now you can swap as well. And over time, I feel bridge UIs will eventually take over like DEX UIs, because if you can cross-chain swap on any chain, you can also like do same chain swaps on like every chain. The functionality of a bridge becomes similar to a DEX as the ecosystem moves towards a more like cross-chain ecosystem.
Yeah, but I'm curious, like, how do you like? I totally agree, and I think right, like, I definitely heard, like, I hear honestly plenty of people who just like use Jumper as like a same chain DEX, right? Because like, I already know bridging in there. Why not do my like same chain DEX swaps in there, right? So to totally hear that from one side, right? Like, as I say, bridge UIs basically move towards like kind of general purpose like trading venues, I guess, so to speak. And then I would say, right, like obviously on the wallet side, right, like obviously they are also like adding more and more of like bridging and like swapping functionality into the wallets. And I think it's totally plausible, right, like that I think how wallets basically become chain abstracted, right, where like wallets already hold funds, like we have a unified balance, right? All great. I'm curious, like, how do you see like will Bridge UI stop at the general swapping layer, or will they basically become like wallets?
I mean, so they can. Again, it depends. Like a UI like Infinex is going for the super app, super wallet, fat app kind of a UI UX, right? Bridge UIs, I feel like it depends on how the team sees their expertise as well, because swapping is one thing, trading is a totally different ball game. You need like different types of features, and then meme coin trading is like a totally different UI. So I feel like even in swapping and trading, there are so many levels that you can optimize for. That building out something else, like let's say, I don't know, NFTs or something else on the UI, is again dependent on what direction you want to take as your team. So I feel like there's a world where you can just optimize for meme coin trading. Like there are so many apps that do so much more volume than Bridge UIs that are optimized for meme coin trading, right? So I feel like it's literally on the team and how they see what generates more order flow. If that's what, actually, that's literally what everyone is optimizing for.
Yeah, but how do you think about, let's say, like resource locks or chain abstraction, right? Like, how does a Bridge UI become kind of like a chain abstracted Bridge UI? Because like, doesn't that require basically some notion of kind of like, right, like you said, instead of like an escrow contract that just like is just like just in time, now there's this kind of like persistent, right? Like users basically have funds in these persistent contracts, and like who's going to be responsible for, right, like managing that user experience? Is it the Bridge UI or is it the wallet?
I think so. It's the wallets and the account manager sort of. So if the ecosystem moves in the direction of being okay with depositing funds into a wallet and then using app interfaces, like that's what will happen. But the thing is, like, 2 years ago there was a wallet or like an app interface called Avocado by the Instadap team. It was very similar to what today people talk about chain abstraction, but it did not see too much adoption. Again, not sure why. Maybe people were just not used to that UI UX. But I feel like as mental models change, there is a possibility that this UX will become more common. But the jury is still out. Like today, people still think about chains as like specific ecosystems. I have to move funds from one chain to another. So the mental model, like we're meeting users where they are at today, but that might change in the future. Like you don't know.
Yeah, like I think that's definitely like maybe coming back to, I think your right, like I think observation that like maybe there weren't as many events about chain abstraction. Like I think while there might have not been these events, I think there were definitely kind of these kind of conversations of kind of like like how, right, like how will people consume Interop basically, right? Like how will we create this, right? In the inner offsite event, right? Like the kind of the leading like goal that we had for the session was basically like, how does Ethereum feel like one account again, right? Like how, when you kind of like are in the Ethereum ecosystem, like right now you have all of these different like UIs and wallets and switches, and like how can we get to the point where it feels like one? And I think chain abstraction, like I think is totally the end game. But I wonder, like you said, right, like if it's going to be within the wallets, then I think we put a lot of I think onus on the wallet, and like right, like maybe Bridge UIs like Jumper have to like have specific functionality per wallet to be able to kind of support features that these wallets provide, which I feel like I guess is somewhat reminiscent of like the even just the account abstraction question, right? Like, oh, like you can now, like even right now, I think it's super hard to build just a general dApp UI that leverages like account abstraction, because all of our dApps are so built with like, oh, I will index my own data and like my own account data. And so there's, I think, so much infrastructure that is necessary to even get to the point where we can have chain abstracted wallets and therefore dApps that they can use that leverage that specific functionality. And I think I'm actually super bullish on like, I don't know, teams like Uniswap, right, who kind of decide to basically like own the full stack end to end, because they will be able to make certain trade-offs that I think is going to be just more difficult if you have to like coordinate between both a wallet and a Bridge UI. And so, I feel like, I think there's this like cycle of like modularization and then like monolithic, like bringing it back as a monolith. And so maybe this is going to be one of the reasons why we will see it back.
I mean, we're talking about standards for Interop, but then think about account abstraction. That's been a thing for the last 3 years, and we're only now seeing standards, like they're not even implemented yet, but only now seeing standards actually coming to the picture where, okay, wallets are changing 3 years later, right? So it only makes me think, when will all of these Interop token standards, or not even token standards, Interop standards be shipped on like Ethereum mainnet?
Yes. I think, this is maybe full circle where, it's super... Like, I think just looking at things like account abstraction, right? You're just like, oh my God, like, right? Like Vitalik basically like pushed this for years, right? There's like, the F has funded the whole team. Like we have like all of these people, right? Like Alchemy and everybody going all in on account abstraction. And we still don't really have, right? Like an easy, experience of that. And so I think I can see why people are like super jaded by like, oh, like standards just make no sense, right? But then also we talk about all the other things of like, oh, if you're an ecosystem, you cannot afford to build this from scratch. Like this just becomes absolutely untenable. And so I think maybe it's very hard to keep both of those like things in mind of like, oh, I can't build this by myself, but also standards take a long time. But I think there's really only one way, and maybe we just need to all invest in a good meditation class so that we don't lose our minds.
Okay, so like the final point, I feel like Interop is at a good point where literally everyone is talking about it. There are building blocks that people can use and actually maybe solve Interop for their own ecosystems. What do you think about where we are at in terms of Interop's adoption and the adoption and like development of all of our protocols?
Where are we at? Yeah, look, I think I don't know if it is cheating to like ask you the question first, but I think like like sometimes the phrase like Interop is solved is thrown around, and I think I was actually talking to Angus about this last week as well, where like I think we definitely converging, I would say, on right like the base building blocks, right? Like I think it's like I said, like right, like it's like you need some notion of messaging, you need some notion of like right like settlement and security mechanism, you need some notion of like kind of like liquidity like layers on top of that, right? And that's kind of like 80%, let's say, of Interop. And I think it's clear that like right, like we have these building blocks, I guess. But like I definitely think just because we have those building blocks doesn't mean that I think that we're like I guess that's solved, so to speak. Like I think like what we lack a lot, and honestly like the Vibe attack obviously like was a very good reflection of that, is that like we're in a super adversarial environment, and even though we haven't maybe seen a bridge hack in a while, like I think you could argue that like a lot of the trust assumptions in Interop are still like pretty poor, and like it's solved in the sense that like it has worked for last year and maybe like no super major bridge hack, but like like if Lazarus can kind of like compromise a team like Safe, which right, like the whole industry has relied on for like the securing of the assets, right? Like all these token standards, right? Like most of these message bridges are still like a lot of them are like secured by effectively Gnosis safes, right? And so that means that like a lot of the like value secured by Interop is like I think still on a like limited foothold. And so like I think I would like decisively kind of go back and say like, it's definitely not solved. It definitely feels not solved. There's so many things that I know we want to kind of like improve, because honestly, like again, in this world of like where Interop is becoming more permissionless, right? Like basically more and more teams. Like I certainly predict that pretty much any team in crypto will have to think about Interop, right? Like just like you cannot think about a project only in the context of a single chain anymore. Like all of those teams now become basically like, oh, I have to manage Interop, right? And part of that will mean I have to like, maybe like govern contracts, and I have to like kind of like set trust assumptions for these contracts. And that like, talking to teams feels very, very rudimentary still. And it's like, there's so much more work to do. And so I think, I feel like in these debriefs that we do now, right, like after Bangkok and after Denver, we always already talk about like, everybody already talks about Interop, and that's basically 100%. So like, there's no more Interop to be had. Like you can't have more Interop than 100%. But like certainly my prediction is like you can, and there will be so much more Interop. People will be like even like if you sick of Interop today, like you will be even more sick of Interop in like 6 months, because this is just like a core competency that has to be solved, and this is something that people cannot solve by themselves.
I mean, I feel like I definitely agree with you. And I keep saying this to Angus as well. Like, context is very important, because this is such an absolute statement. Like, Interop is solved, right? Like, it's such an absolute statement that I'm not a fan. But I feel like context is important in the sense that if both of us are talking about Interop, we know that this is not the end state. There are so many more developments to be done. Like, safety can be better, trust assumptions can be like figured out. But I feel like if we're talking towards the outside ecosystem, we can actually say that the building blocks are already there for you to solve Interop. So the statement works in that context, but is Interop solved? No, like it can always be better. But are the building blocks there? Yes, you can actually solve Interop for your ecosystem. So I feel like context is important, but like it's fine. It's again, how do you define the accuracy of a statement?
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is going to be like, I think I guess maybe it's less the accuracy of the statement and more the fact that the statement came about relatively recently, right? And then you have to think about kind of oh, what is true now that wasn't true, let's say, a year ago. And I would say, honestly, the building blocks were there even 2, 3, 4 years ago, right? I think it was just that we're really filling out. Sometimes the way I think about Hyperlane, right, is really what we're doing is we're just building a lot of really good developer tooling and infrastructure, right? I don't know that we are inventing much new things, and I don't know that things had to be invented even 3 years ago. And I think that was maybe I think the implication in Interop Solved is that we brought the kind of key part to building blocks that now is solved. And I do think if you look at rollup bridges, all of this already existed, right? Hop, was one of the OG kind of intense things way back in the days. And so I think I definitely don't know that it's a new thing. Either basically Interop has been solved this whole time, or it's not solved yet. I think you have to
even if it's a marketing thing, I feel if it actually tells the ecosystem that, okay, you don't have to reinvent every single Interop building block yourself, I'm okay with it.
I totally support. I totally agree that I think in the beginning there was a lot of have to build it from self, and I do think what has changed, and again we'll see a lot more of that, is that people be okay, maybe I don't have to build everything, right? Even if you think about rollup bridges, right? Rollup bridges are basically the same thing. And now, if you're going to start a new rollup, which honestly people should keep doing, right? This, I don't know that the rollup kind of proof space is really solved yet. But when you do so, maybe don't start from scratch, right? Don't reinvent how you custody funds on Ethereum. How do you have the developer interface for people? That is something that you should totally not build from scratch. But I'm biased, but
Okay, I think this was a good debrief. To be honest, I didn't think we could have all of these talking points, but it's nice to actually sit down and think about all the conversations we had over the last week. What's the next big conference that we're going to debrief?
Ooh, I think usually people would say oh, it's going to be ECC. I think the jury's out on whether people will make their way to Con. That just feels very, I guess, extensive. I'm from Berlin. I'm biased, but I think Protocol Berg and DAppCon, and I think just generally the blockchain week, I think will be nice. But so maybe that's a good time to I guess we'll just do it quarterly, I guess, right? Just every quarter we'll debrief some conference somewhere. But
I have to be there to actually debrief, so I don't want to go to literally every conference though.
What is the next one you're gonna go to?
I don't know. So there needs to be consensus around what's the big conference so that I can decide this is worth my time.
Yes, fair enough. There needs to be some challenge. Maybe there needs to be a poly market that decides for all of us where we're gonna go.
That's a good idea. Maybe someone can take it up and we actually decide if it's ETHCC or are we meeting up in Berlin.
Yeah.
But awesome. Thanks a lot for doing this. I feel anyone who is not there will have a good sense of where Interop is at. Is it solved or not? Figure it out for yourself. The building blocks are there.
They are.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Arjun.